Hi everyone, thanks for joining us with this interview with Naomi Klein. We're here talking about her new book, No Is Not Enough, out now from Haymarket Books, our friends and frequent collaborators at Haymarket. You missed a lot of great banter. We spent the last 15 minutes debating the merits of McRibs. You could guess what side, I came down on that debate. But yeah, so how's your tour and your trip been so far?
It's been great. Last night we were in Washington, D.C. and did a on-stage conversation with Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and I told her she's kind of like the only elected politician, certainly at the federal level, that I would have wanted to do that with. I'm a big fan of hers and endorsed her run, and it was really good to be there with her because she was able to talk to people directly. The city was in shock because of the shooting, and for everyone on Capitol Hill, they're really scared. She's playing baseball today, in this game. And so she was able to speak to people, speak to that moment, show real leadership. And we were talking about Trump and as a brand and whether or not he can be held accountable for anything because he's created this immoral brand of just doing whatever it takes to win. But she is one of I think it's 190 Congress people, and she's one of the people who's been spearheading this lawsuit that was just launched yesterday to try to sue the president for violating the Constitution, the Emoluments Clause that says that he can't take gifts and benefits from foreign governments. So it ended up being great, like just timing-wise, to be there with Pramila. Mm-hmm. So that was awesome.
So obviously Trump is really odious and has this kind of like this brand that seems like it permeates every part of our society now, and I guess more aptly kind of sprung out from it. But in a sense, like a lot of people on the left have been saying, well, there's a kind of honesty to Trump's brand, and that it just like the naked exploitation and the naked exploitation of our common resources, the planet and whatnot, but just without the sugar coating of the past. And I disagree with this analysis. I think there is a profound difference between even the administration we would get with a mainstream Republican, or especially with even a neoliberal Democrat like Obama or Clinton and Trump. But what would you say to the kind of the idea that Trump is just kind of one head of a two-headed beast?
I think that there are things that the Republicans are able to get away with because Trump is different than any president we've seen before, right? Specifically, his flair for drama, both deliberately created and inflicted upon him. I mean, this has been incredibly useful for the Republican Party's economic agenda, which I don't think is any different under Trump than it would be under Ryan or Pence or any of these guys. I mean, we know what their wish list is, but gosh, how useful is it for them that they're able to dismantle Dodd-Frank, throw millions of people off of healthcare, it's looking that way, and redistribute wealth upwards on absolutely every front. Any one of these things would be a massive national story under a traditional politician, but because of Trump, it's kind of like, look over here, and I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, but I think there's lots to look at over there, right? It's legit. Like, obviously, this has to be investigated, but I don't think the Republicans ever dreamed of having it so good, So that's happening.
And I guess for us on the left and just for working people generally, there's just like every single day there's new things in the news, and it's just a constant onslaught. So you want to a lot of us who, let's say, are obviously very concerned about climate change, but don't focus primarily on climate justice or whatnot. Yeah. We're getting very interest in mobilizations around that Trump's proposed tearing up of the Paris Climate Accords, because of course he could make a better deal. And but then immediately there's new revelations about Russia. There's the continuing pushing through of Trump care, which would immediately cause so much harm to so many people. But it seems like in general, like compared to when we last met, I guess at the anti-inauguration, you gave your speech, and there was, it was really well received. I think all the speeches there, and a lot of that discussion, that period, it was all about not just, a lot of things you touched on in your book, not just kind of saying no to Trump, but posing a positive alternative and thinking about what it would take to actually have political parties that were fighting in the interests of working people and actually seemed like they were delivering something. But it seems lately we're kind of shifting towards, an emphasis on maybe legalistic ways to attack Trump, like through impeachment or whatnot. And on the one hand, obviously, I think there's clearly grounds for impeachment. So I don't want to be against those efforts, but do you think it is almost a zero-sum game where we could either focus on kind of a more bread and butter critique of what Trump's doing, or we kind of I'll leave it there. It was a long rambling question.
Well, I think it would just be prudent to hedge one's bets, and I actually think they're interrelated in the sense that the Republicans are the only ones who can impeach Trump, and they're not going to impeach him so long as he continues to be useful to them, so long as he continues to be popular with his base. And I do think they'll throw him under the bus because he's very volatile, but right now he's doing stuff they haven't been able to do, and they're not sure whether there would be a huge backlash among Trump's base at this point if they were to. What concerns me is this kind of all in on this legalistic approach and the impeachment approach. Because so long as Trump remains popular, it is not going to happen. The Democrats do not control the House. We know this, right? And I think in terms of eroding his popularity, it does absolutely nothing to focus on, on Russia and obstructed justice or any of it, because the thing about the Trump brand is that his brand is being an asshole. His brand is being the biggest asshole possible in order to win. And that is what he's been selling his entire adult life. There is a large market for this in a time of layers of insecurity among that base. Some of that insecurity is economic, and I think it's important to say that people have a right to economic security. All people, and some of it is totally illegitimate. It's about a loss of status for white men in society, a power over other people that they don't have a right to, and it's all mixed up together in this Trump promise of I'm going to make you the top dog again, right? So the problem is. The problem with having a president who is a brand and is playing by the rules of branding is that his base identifies with him. He's been selling an aspirational identity now for decades. And so when you attack Trump, you're attacking them. And it's Team Democrats versus Team Trump or Team Make America Great Again, because that's the other brand. That's another political brand. And that brand, Make America Great Again, stand up for the working class, I think can be really eroded by focusing on the economic betrayals, At the same time he pulled out of NAFTA, and I tweeted this on the day, at the same time he pulled out of the Paris Accord, Wilbur Ross, literally the same day, was reassuring an audience of business leaders that they were going to renegotiate NAFTA to make it even worse for workers, and that what he said was that they were going to use the best practices in the TPP and apply them to NAFTA, right? Now that should have been a huge story, because that is like a kind of smoking gun of betrayal to Trump's working class base that was galvanized by what he was saying about NAFTA. And so I think it is a zero-sum game if MSNBC is deciding, or some of the shows on MSNBC is deciding, we are just going all in on this Russia thing, and if that's the strategy, if that's what you think, then that's what you're going to do at the expense of all of this. And so you're going to shoot yourself in the foot because his brand and his relationship and his base is not going to be eroded, because the only thing he's vulnerable on with them is economics. And then the Republicans will not throw him under the bus. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I grew up in New York, so I grew up around a lot of people who kind of reminded me of Trump. Sometimes in a pleasant way. People just said everything was like incredible or amazing, and just kind of like the Queen's like Trumpism.
Right.
And like I like them in like 10-minute doses a week. Like seeing Trump on TV every day can get exhausting. But so I guess the one politician at a national level that's been putting forward this kind of left populist alternative to Trump has been Bernie Sanders. And he's obviously come under some criticism in the immediate weeks and months after Trump's election for still kind of criticizing Democrats and for saying certain things in vague terms, like under certain circumstances he would work with Trump, but only if X, Y, Z. What do you make of his last kind of few months? And I guess we just both recently saw him at the People's Summit. And do you think there's like that presents some sort of viable alternative at a national level, or whether that coalition isn't enough?
The coalition represented by...
Not just Sanders, but that kind of rhetoric, let's say, even broader than the people who just voted for Sanders.
The rhetoric of working with Trump sometimes?
No, the rhetoric more broadly of left economic populism.
I think it represents it is a huge part of what the message needs to be, but it's not the only part, right? Because, I think that this, what I said at the People's Summit is, like it can't just be like Bernie would have won. Like I do think that there's a solid chance that Bernie would have won if he'd won the primary, but he didn't win the primary. Okay,
no, right.
And it's worth looking at why he didn't win the primary, because just as it's, I think, wholly illegitimate for the Clinton campaign and the DNC elite to blame their loss on the Russians and hacking and WikiLeaks or whoever, and Comey, all of which played a part. Ultimately they have to take responsibility for the fact that they did not galvanize their base. They did not motivate people to vote. And I think it would be nice to hear some of that from the Bernie campaign,
right.
Because I certainly, I endorse Bernie and have a huge amount of respect for him. Some disagreements with him, but I have feminist friends and friends who are very active on criminal justice and racial justice in other areas who really wanted to support Bernie, but didn't believe that he truly deeply understood their issues, and that and we're getting this message, whether fairly or unfairly, of just like rising tide will lift all boats, we'll fix the economy and everything will fix itself, and it really wasn't reckoning with the role of race in American history in a deep way, in a holistic way, which is different than just adding a message to your list of like that's not all that different. Well, I mean it is different, but like like the Hillary Clinton sort of like let's make a list and make everybody feel seen. Like I think the moment calls for something else. The moment calls for like a deeper connections about the role of white supremacy, of racism, of pitting people against each other along lines of race and gender and sexuality in order to impose this brutal form of capitalism, and that has been in play since well before the founding of this country, right? The understanding that the two inputs that created the Industrial Revolution were stolen indigenous land and stolen African people, and the only thing that could allow that was the creation of scientific racism, of creating theories of human hierarchy based on race to justify those two thefts that created modern capitalism. And that's, in the book, why, like quoting Cedric Robinson and the idea that it should be called racial capitalism, like what we have and what we've always had since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, not just in the United States, but since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, has been racial capitalism, not just capitalism. So I think that's the task, not just like, it's just enough to be economic populists.
Yeah.
Because why wouldn't we learn that lesson? If Bernie had gotten 50% of the black vote in key states, he would have won. If Bernie had been able to appeal to more women of my generation, he would have won. And it's not because they're right-wing assholes. It's because he didn't have a story, he didn't have a narrative, an understanding of history, resonance. So this is not about Bernie bashing. This is like the left's problem, broadly.
But it's also about having kind of a culture and a climate where we feel we don't just kind of set up heroes that we can't criticize, where we actually think about the campaign. I think often what people let's say me, for instance, often during the campaign got very defensive about Bernie on this issue, just because I think too often people were interpreting it as like a problem of program, because he was a left-wing economic populist, therefore he couldn't do other things, or that was a thing turning people off, as opposed to as an organizing problem. And the two are somewhat related, but I think that the truth is there just weren't a lot of Bernie volunteers, and states in the South were in predominantly black communities. Right.
People were using it really cynically in order to justify backing Hillary Clinton, who was 1,000 times worse on these very issues. So that made a lot of us defensive of Bernie. But what I'm saying now is we're no longer in the primaries, and there are a lot of people who wanted to support Bernie and didn't, at least not vocally. They may have voted for him, right? Because of these issues, not because they're Hillary Clinton shills. And those, we all know that was a factor, and we saw the emails, that were leaked, coordinating this exact attack. So both things are true simultaneously.
Right.
There was a coordinated, dishonest attack that was coordinated by Hillary's campaign. We saw those emails,
And he also didn't resonate with certain. My mother's reason for initially not backing Bernie was, don't you know Bernie wants free universal health care and all these other good things? I'm like, yes. And she says, well, they'll never let him get that, and plus Trump would beat him. And Hillary Clinton, in other words, I think for a lot of people was the known commodity. Yeah. She was the person that you knew what you were going to get and expect. And I think for people the familiarity made sense. I mean, there's often been a lot of talk about this anti-establishment mood in the country, and I think some people in the country felt it and had it, but for huge chunks of the country, they didn't really want the leap into unknown, especially immigrant communities and the black community and certain parts of the black community and others that kind of feared the populism of Trump and just wanted the surest bet to defeat it.
Well, absolutely, and I was just talking to a friend in the UK, and what you see. There are different responses to Corbyn's surge, right? And there are some people who genuinely did not want him to win, who sort of kind of progressive neoliberals, and they're still alarmed. But there's this whole other camp that did not support Corbyn because they thought he was a totally unviable candidate. But now that he's proven that he is a viable candidate, they are ready to back him, and they're thrilled,
Right.
and so. I think we could definitely get to that point in this country.
So speaking of Corbyn, it seemed to me that, what Theresa May kind of did in the immediate aftermath of Brexit and all this kind of this chaos going on in Britain, to call it a snap election when she already had a mandate for several years and already had a healthy majority, was this kind of, basically throwing a shock, right? Like you dealt with in your past books, and expected people in a very hurried, frenzied campaign to either not turn out or to vote against this leader that a lot of people thought, or at least the media at least, was pushing the narrative was kind of this incompetent leftist who just likes eating cold beans and playing in his garden. Literally, these are the criticisms. I'm not making this up. The cold beans thing was on that line.
Baked beans was a huge story.
Right. But I guess it turned out different. Is there a lesson we could kind of take from this, or is it? I mean, a lot of people also try to maybe draw too easy of a one-to-one comparison between Sanders, Corbyn, our movement here, and their movement. But
well, I do think there is a lesson about the value of an honest messenger, like somebody who's really led a life of integrity. you know, because I think there is also this sort of like, we need our shiny, charismatic brand that's going to beat Trump. And, you know, I think charisma is important. But so is that quality of trust, right? And I think there's just something about this resonance of these old guys with millennials where it's this, you know, it is precisely that they are anti-brands, that they can't begin to understand. I mean, they do not focus group their messages in any way. They're the absolute antithesis of these sort of very slick, very packaged politicians. And so they try to take, Jeremy Corbyn down by presenting him as this mad beekeeper, you know, and that actually is precisely what is working for young people, you know, like the fact that he is so unproduced makes him trustworthy. I think in this country, that's probably not going to be the type of candidate that's going to be put forward, which is why what I've been emphasizing is the need for social movements to come together and get super clear on what the demands are, what the vision is, what the policies are, that are the deal breakers, that and to have a kind of a contract with candidates, so that if a shiny, charismatic candidate comes forward and is ready to be the one, you know, that taps into that energy. You know, I don't know whether I don't know whether Bernie's going to run again or not, and if he does, there's going to be he's not going to be the only one. And I think it would be really useful to take a page from the Tea Party in terms of holding any politician accountable. I don't know if they have to sign a contract, you know, with the People's Platform, but I would love for there to be mechanisms of responsibility, because short of having, you know, a Corbyn-style figure, it's really needed, or people will, you know, I would fear, be betrayed, you know, pour a huge amount of political energy into a campaign only to discover they've got somebody who's, you know, not going to make good on those promises, and then you betray the hopes of a generation, and plus we don't have the time, you know, on so many different fronts, including climate.
Right. I think people, I guess, is it in robotics where there's an uncanny valley or something, like the closest something becomes to be like looking like a real human being at some point. We like it, and then we reach a point of revulsion when it comes too close to being almost human. And I think that like third wave politicians kind of became like that. Like Tony Blair was like slick and young or whatever, but they're almost like too choreographed and too polished. And in the Republican primaries, I think it's one of the reasons why people didn't like Marco Rubio, and you know, these other politicians, like someone like Martin O'Malley, you would guess in the abstract would be more appealing than Bernie Sanders. He's more polished. He doesn't have all these, you know, verbal tics and stuff like that. So maybe we should be looking for more unconventional politicians, but also people from like labor unions and from social movements, and not necessarily these career politicians.
People who have a life story that genuinely reflects a different set of values, like what concept, you know?
Right, people who didn't want to be president at any point in their life before, like the 6 months before they were asked. I think that's what we, you know.
Well, look at the story of the People's Summit. I know, you know, we're wrapping up, but just to have this space created by nurses, right? The People's Summit was organized by National Nurses United in coalition with many other groups, but they were the anchor of the People's Summit, and we heard a lot from nurses during that gathering, which is quite unique, you know, in left spaces. And to hear so many people, overwhelmingly women, many women of color, talking from a place of deep experience about having devoted their lives to the care of others, and getting to the point where they understand that the crises we are facing are so deep that it now requires system change, that they can't, that even treating the whole person is only treating the symptoms, because it is the system that is making people so sick, and the system that is sick. And having that coming from that place of integrity, of living one's life based on a principle of care and empathy, like that's powerful, you know. And Corbyn's campaign, I mean, God, those Ken Loach ads just slayed me, and still do. Putting caregivers up front, breaking down, I mean, God, I'll cry again thinking about it.
Yeah, we have a politics based on solidarity, and we sometimes talk about that very abstractly instead of like what this means day to day. And I think that's something the Labour Party in the last few weeks of that campaign was really able to do.
And they're still doing it. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn right now is
Is at
the housing estate, you know, comforting people and being there. And, you know, Elizabeth May, you know, can has to be surrounded with protection because she knows she'll be ambushed by people. And she's, you know, I mean, but people are responding to this, and maybe this is the legacy of just fakery for so long.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess we'll wrap up with just, I mean, I kind of danced around but didn't actually directly talk much about the book itself, which is an excellent, really riveting read. And one thing you do early on in the book is kind of connect your work so far, connect the movements you were talking about, No Logo, with your investigations in the shock doctrine, with your kind of emphasis in on climate justice issues, with kind of this in a way that kind of made it seem like a whole, which it is, but in a certain way, the spirit of this book is slightly different than the spirit of some of the movements you were talking about, No Logo, and that period that a lot of us were involved in. I was born in '89, so my first forays into politics was the anti-Iraq War movement. But still, you know, these are movements based on based on resistance, based on stopping something. Yeah. It was a good year for me. I was, life was easy before I read a book. Life was easy. So I guess the question is, now it seems like a lot of your emphasis is on the need to present an affirmative kind of alternative. Was this a shortcoming of earlier movements, or was this just something that an evolution that had to happen? And in particular, I guess I want to ask too about a few times your talk on Monday and elsewhere, you've kind of broadly defined, in a very ecumenical way, your the vision of this alternative as being like a democratic socialist one. Is this something that do you think using that word is particularly important? Do you think it could alienate certain people or box us in too closely ideologically? Again, I'm not a great interviewer. Yeah. I just gave you 8 questions. You could choose to answer some or all of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I would just say about this book is that it does tie those. It does sort of tie those various kind of arguments together, which I always saw as a kind of evolution anyway. In my own thinking, because the kind of the neoliberalism that I was writing about in No Logo kind of came into crisis at the turn of the millennium because there was so much resistance, and World Trade Organization and talks came to a standstill. The IMF stopped being able to talk about the Washington Consensus. Governments were starting to stand up. We were starting to see left-wing governments get elected in Latin America, and when I went to Iraq and covered the economic side of the invasion and what was being imposed on Iraq under cover of war, was, in my analysis, a result of the crisis of neoliberalism, right? That it was no longer possible to have a veneer of democracy and imposing neoliberalism. You couldn't politely negotiate it at the World Trade Organization anymore. They tried to ram the free trade area of the Americas down people's throats, and we stopped it. We stopped it right before this. It was the huge protests in 2001, and then as the left governments in Latin America were elected, the whole thing was tanked. So when I was first writing about the invasion of Iraq, that was my analysis, right or wrong, was now there can't be any veneer of consent for this project, so they're having to harness shocks and crises, it's neoliberalism, down the barrel of a gun, right? But and that's what sort of and then because we happened to go to Argentina. And actually, I watched the war begin from Argentina because we were making the take there at that point. The the Argentinians were saying, well, this is what happened to us. You know, this is full circle for the neoliberal project. It started in Blood and Fire, and now it's happening again. And there was actually just a very brief period where there was a veneer that you could do this peacefully, right? So anyway, I always saw it as part of, look at, you know, obviously one thing leads to another in life, you know. But this book is very much, I think, comes out of the work, the activist work that I've been doing since This Changes Everything came out, which was just kind of like, you know, my friend and colleague Bill McKibben, you know, talks about founding 350, you know, co-founding 350 because he came to this crazy realization that books don't change the world, movements do, you know, after having written, you know, the first book about climate change for a popular audience some quarter century ago, right? And I kind of got to a similar place with The Leap in Canada of just like, okay, like I've written this book about how all of this is interconnected and we need this, you know, intersectional movement that's going to connect the dots between climate change and austerity and migration and, you know, and economic justice and then we just like, you know, it turned out that it was useful for us to play this convening role, for our little group in Canada to play this convening role of bringing a lot of those movements together, who agreed but didn't have a space, right? And this is something, you know, you've heard me talk about before, of just like, and I know that you've written about, I mean, that we are, like, it's hard to organize broad-based movements in the rubble of neoliberalism because there just aren't spaces that will be your home, you know, and that's another thing that was nice about the People's Summit. It's been a long time since the trade union movement has offered up its infrastructure to social movements and said, come, like let's get together and find common ground. And so, you know, we started off as we called ourselves a political pop-up, you know, like where it's like we're not an organization, but we're going to just try to create some space for people to come together and come up with this broad-based, forward-looking vision. Which uses climate change as a catalyst, but is about a deep economic and social and values-based transition. We don't we don't put a label on it. You know, people called us everything. You know, we called it the Leap Manifesto, so of course they called us Maoists. You know, it's like
right. Well, that's clever though. That's actually that's you know I expect worse from our opponents. You know, I didn't know they had that deep historical reservoir.
Oh boy, we got the great leap forward on day one. Yeah, but. I identify a lot of what we are trying to do with the democratic socialist agenda, but I do think it is incredibly important to reckon with the ecological failures of socialism, and I don't think that traditional democratic socialism has done that. So whether or not, you know, people get so passionate about, one of the things I say at the end of the book is that we all need to challenge our inner brands, you know, and kill our inner Trumps, and part of that is that, like, it has to be my word and your word and my brand, and, you know, and I'm just not that concerned with it. I don't think I've heard the perfect word, but I think if it's going to have socialism in it, it should probably have eco, you know, because, like, there's only 2 points in history when emissions have gone down dramatically, and, you know, one of them was when communism collapsed, and the other one was when capitalism collapsed. So, right. You know, we should be aware of that.
Well, books might not change the world, but people who read books, well, you know, that's actually really corny. This is why I don't do a live video. It sounded better in my head. But you should read No Is Not Enough, and it's published by Haymarket Books. It's published by a left-wing independent press, so, you know, you should go out there to the stores and actually buy it. Don't just wait to read your friend's copy.